4 years ago this week, presidential candidate Senator Barack Obama was wrapping up a worldwide tour through Europe and the Middle East, designed to amp up his foreign policy credentials. Here's what that looked like. As many as 200,000 people crowded their way into Berlin's Tiergarten Park to hear Senator Obama's vision for the world in July of 2008, and to cheer, and cheer, and cheer some more.
The greatest danger of all is to allow new walls to divide us from one another. The walls between old allies on either side of the Atlantic cannot stand. The walls between the countries with the most and those with the least cannot stand. The walls between races and tribes, natives and immigrants, Christians and Muslims and Jews cannot stand. These now are the walls we must tear down.
Senator Obama was greeted abroad like a political rock star, and not just by his tens of thousands of adoring fans. As Frank Rich put it at the time, Senator Obama was treated like a, quote, president in waiting by foreign heads of state and the media, too. 4 years later, it's election season again, and there's a new candidate who's out to prove his foreign policy bona fides. And this week, it's Mitt Romney's turn to tour the world and try to look presidential. So Mr. Romney, you might have heard, is not having the same kind of foreign policy trip that Barack Obama had 4 years ago. Yesterday's headlines were dominated with fallout from Mr. Romney's gaffe-filled first day abroad, including his total diss of London's Olympic hosting abilities. And today's were all about his embarrassing walkback of said gaffes. Back here at home, the dynamic duo of Louisiana Governor Bobby Jindal and Virginia Governor Bob Ultrasound McDonald set about to try to turn Mr. Romney's bad press in Europe into good politics in America. Governor Jindal telling a conference call today, quote, "We're not worried about overseas headlines. We're worried about voters back here at home in America." So Governor Jindal making the calculation that Americans don't care about headlines in foreign papers. Look, he's probably right. Americans certainly are not basing their vote on British editorializing. But it does seem to me that we can learn a lot about a candidate by how they interact on the world stage. Senator Obama's world tour in 2008 as a presidential candidate wasn't just about how the kids loved him so bad in Berlin. He also visited Iraq, where he met with the prime minister and top U.S. military commanders in Baghdad. And he went to Afghanistan, where he met with American NATO troops and with Afghan President Ahmed Karzai, and called for more troops and more focus on the war in Afghanistan. Now, for those of you keeping track at home, this is what President George W. Bush's exit from the international stage looked like.
شكرا جزيلا. So what if the guy threw a shoe at me?
That happened during George W. Bush's final trip to the two war zones he led America into as president. Make no mistake, I certainly do not condone shoe throwing or any other kind of attempted assault or disrespect of a world leader for that matter. But the shoe throwing incident was sort of emblematic of Bush-era foreign policy. George W. Bush did not play well with others on the international stage. And by the time he left office, his foreign policy agenda was deeply unpopular both overseas and at home. And that's where Mitt Romney's foray into foreign policy leadership comes in. With the minor disasters of his debut in London behind him, Mr. Romney granted an interview with an Israeli newspaper ahead of his upcoming visit there. The newspaper, incidentally, is part owned by billionaire Republican donor Sheldon Adelson. So there's that. But what's really important about this interview is that what Mitt Romney had to say about foreign policy. When asked for his thoughts on the U.S. response to the Arab Spring, here's what Mr. Romney had to say, quote, "The Arab Spring is not appropriately named. It has become a development of more concern, and it occurred in part because of the reluctance on the part of various dictators to provide more freedom to their citizens." President George W. Bush urged opposed Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak to move toward a more democratic posture. But President Obama abandoned the freedom agenda, and we are seeing today a whirlwind of tumult in the Middle East, in part because these nations did not embrace the reforms that could have changed the course of their history in a more peaceful manner. So to be clear, Mitt Romney is arguing in favor of the George W. Bush foreign policy plan. He's saying the Middle East is all messed up because President Obama abandoned President Bush's freedom agenda? You see, in other words, day 2 of Mitt Romney's foreign tour involves telling a foreign newspaper owned by a right-wing American billionaire donor that he wants to get back to Bush-era foreign policy. He thinks George W. Bush was doing it right. And that's where he wants to take the country and the world, back to the George W. Bush way of doing things.
So what if the guy threw a shoe at me?
The fact is simply this, that being the president of the United States is not just the domestic management position that the Romney campaign might wish it were. The president of the United States is, in fact, important to the rest of the world. In fact, for citizens in many countries, he may have more direct life or death decision-making power over them than he does over Americans, because he's less fettered by Congress and by federalism in his role as commander-in-chief. And that means that the world tour of an American candidate for president is not just a beauty pageant. It very well might not matter in terms of the vote count back home in November, but a president or presidential candidate's presence overseas is substantive. And Mitt Romney's decision to embrace the George W. Bush version of American foreign policy might give America watchers pause, not to mention how it makes the American public feel.